This is the recording for July 20th. This is going to be a little unique. I'm not going to teach anything new statistically here, but what I'm going to start with is going over kind of the follow-up homework assignment about the two articles from Natural News and Depression During Pregnancy. And what I'd ask that you do is kind of summarize what I have to say. Hopefully it maps pretty well to what your assignment was, and we can take it kind of another step here. So the two articles basically talk about should pregnant women be taking psychiatric products. And hopefully what you came to the conclusion of is that the two articles were kind of radically different on the approaches and the evidence that they supported in lieu of this. The one article, and we'll start with the Mike Adams article, you notice it's in Natural News. So that should already give you a little bit of a clue. Something in Natural News is probably, before it even looks at the evidence, going to say, don't be on any psychiatric products. And so what we read in the Natural News article is basically an opinion-based article by Mike Adams. Basically, he says, here are all the bad possible things that happen. Here are some bad examples. But it's really nothing more than an opinion-based article written with a slant because, of course, you know even before you read the article, because of Natural News, what it's going to actually say. In terms of the scientific evidence, there's really not very much in there. There's just he pulls various things from various situations and says, here's my opinion. So that's article number one. Article number two, hopefully you came to the conclusion, was a little more of what we call evidence-based. Evidence-based, you noticed who wrote it. It was from the American Psychiatric Association and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and so, or obstetricians and gynecologists. So you'll notice that this article is written in a much more systematic way. It looks like the authors for this are basically looking at all the available evidence. There isn't that much, because you can't really do clinical trials and getting women pregnant and then putting them on psychiatric products, but they review all the available evidence and they make their statements kind of conditional based on various things. So article number two is considered a lot more evidence-based, and that's the main conclusion from these two. So obviously, if you're going to believe one or the other, you should probably go with guidelines or treatment recommendations from the joint groups here, because it's based much more on scientific evidence. It's not direct studies, but it is based on scientific evidence. Which brings us to the point of what that term means, evidence-based medicine or evidence-based approaches, even in psychology. The word evidence-based is the idea very simply that if you want to do something for an intervention, a psychological intervention, a behavioral one, or even a medical one, what is the available evidence that that approach is useful? So it can go in various ways. The lowest form is considered opinion, and we actually get a classic case of opinion in the Natural News article. That's simply that person's opinion. He grabs a few various facts from various elements and tries to make a persuasive case. That's really not based on a lot of scientific evidence. The next level are called case reports. Case reports are usually done by scientific people, and they describe what a patient is going through, a situation that's happening, and they basically describe that. That is a little more scientific and evidence-based. It's a little better than opinion-based, but still it's not really considered that scientific. The next level are research studies, and that's really what we focus on in our particular class. Research studies. Now, there are a couple of different levels of research studies. One level that you should know about is a research study where it's basically, let's say you want to evaluate a behavioral intervention for diabetes. You take people before and then you put them through something and measure them after. That would be a simple pre-post test design. And it doesn't really have any control, and you're basically saying, oh, after the program in this scientific study, it looks like it worked. A better approach is to have a control group, various conditions, and then even at a higher level than that, to try to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. So that would be considered more scientifically sound. A real experimentally controlled trial would be another example of a research study. So if you're going to make recommendations about things, then the idea is try to do experiments, do studies, and see what the evidence says. Now, obviously, in this case, with psychiatric products during pregnancy, you're not allowed to do any studies because it's considered unethical to actually have a group of pregnant women and say, well, I'm going to randomly put you on Prozac, Paxil, or Zoloft. That's not considered ethical, but research studies are many times what we use. The next level of things, you might consider clinical guidelines. Clinical guidelines are guidelines that basically talk about what we should do, what all the experts think in consensus, and I've actually added a little link to that. In asthma, there's actually guidelines on the diagnosis and management of asthma. So I'd ask you to go to that link and just take a look at who's writing this. It's basically written by experts in the field. Here's what we know over 30 years of doing trials and interventions, and here's generally what works. It's written by experts in the field. Your Article 2, Depression During Pregnancy, is basically like that, except of course there can't be guidelines because there's not enough scientific studies, but it's very close to that. The final level of scientific review is considered a Cochrane review. What happens in a Cochrane review, and you'll actually have an example of this with the homework, is 2 or 3 researchers look at all the available scientific evidence and research studies, and they critique them. They say, here is what the evidence says about doing X, Y, or Z to help people in a certain condition. It could be a behavioral intervention, it could be a psychiatric intervention, and they look at all the available evidence and they don't just summarize it, but they actually summarize and critique it and say, these studies were methodologically sound, these ones were not so good. And so that's considered the highest level of evidence-based science or evidence-based medicine or psychology are Cochrane reviews. And you're going to be looking at one that the 2 authors basically summarize. I think it's something about, art therapy working in a Cochrane review. So you can look at that and summarize that. So these are the ideas, and I'd expect you to look at the one link I've added and just type up the summary from this. Hopefully it maps to what you said before. Your homework, besides this, is basically, it's a little bit different this week. It's going to be a setup actually for the final week, and basically the idea is to look at the attached articles. One is on burnout, one is on marriage and divorce, one is on pet therapy, and one is on art therapy, and try to answer to the best of your ability each one of the questions that is there. Try to do that in your own words. Summarize what's going on, and you can have a couple of paragraphs for each one. That would probably be good. You can send me drafts of this, because what we're going to do on the very last class is we're going to come in and actually have data sets kind of based on some of these studies, and we're going to actually do the data analysis there in class, and then you're going to write it up, and that's going to be your final competency-based assignment. So hopefully this makes sense to you. Feel free to email me with drafts or questions about the assignment here, but hopefully this makes sense, and this is your one acoustic bit for this second to last week. Thanks. Bye-bye.